So many different religions represented, Buddhism being the primary one, but hundreds of Taoist manuscripts, which have all been published in 1978 and 79 in a great compendium by Ofuchi Ninji, Tonko Dokyo, or Taoism, Dunhuang Daojiao. An amazing resource. One of the earliest religious Taoist commentaries on the Tao Te Ching is there. The only known Tang Dynasty manuscript copy of the Tao Te Ching is from the library cave, actually more than one copy from the Tang. Very early manuscripts from the Northern Wei Dynasty in remarkable condition. Like many of you, I've had the great honor and privilege of being able to handle some of these manuscripts both in London and in Paris. And it's astonishing when you actually touch these things. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing that one can be allowed to touch these things. But they are, I've handled a Northern Wei manuscript, the Shang commentary on the Tao Te Ching. And it's like a new dollar bill. It's so strong. I mean, the paper, just as a physical object, it has such physicality, such presence. And this is another extraordinary aspect which many of the speakers at this wonderful conference have talked about. Just within the realm of Buddhism alone, there was for many years a great debate on whether one of the seminal Chan texts, the Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, the Liuzi Tanjing, was or was not a Tang text. And there are two copies of that text from the 9th century, Tang copies in the library cave at Dunhuang. Manichaean texts rendered in Chinese, star charts, two of the earliest almanacs, very precise, showing the 12 Jupiter stations in the circumpolar region in the Stein collection, and so on. So it's a subject of fantastic research. It's such a pleasure to have this exhibition, and I want to commend also the GCI and the GRI for bringing this exhibition to Los Angeles. Our goal is to make Los Angeles the center for Chinese art studies on the West Coast, and I think we're well on our way. With this, you know, LA is a cowboy town, but we're ambitious. Our first speaker today is Professor Dr. Imre Galambos, who is lecturer in pre-modern Chinese studies at the University of Cambridge in England. He wrote his dissertation at UC Berkeley on the orthography of Chinese writing during the Warring States period. Subsequently worked for 10 years at the International Dunhuang Project at the British Library and has taught at Cambridge since 2012. He's now preparing a book on the manuscripts produced by students in the 9th and 10th centuries from Dunhuang. And that book will also address translations of Chinese educational and didactic texts into other languages on the Silk Road. His topic today is Dunhuang manuscripts of the Xiaozi Zhuan, or the biographies of filial sons at Dunhuang. Please welcome Professor Galambos.
Well, thank you, Stephen, for the introduction. And I'd like also to thank the organizers, and especially Mimi and Agnew for giving me this opportunity to talk here. Well, you don't often see a crowd like this when you talk about Dunhuang manuscripts outside of China. And I think this is a great thing. So I hope there will be other occasions like this. So today I'm going to talk about these Dunhuang manuscripts of the Xiaozi Zhuan, the biographies of filial sons. Now, originally, when in 1957, Wang Zhongming and his colleagues, they published a collection known as Dunhuang Bianwenji, so the collection of transformation texts from Dunhuang. At the end of the second volume, I think as the last text, they included something they titled the Xiaozi Zhuan, the Dunhuang Xiaozi Zhuan. And this is the text I'm going to talk about today. There are 5 manuscripts, at least in their edition at the time, there were 5 manuscripts of this text. And these 5 manuscripts, you see the first one here. So 2 of them were at the British Library, and 3 of them, well, at the time they were in the British Museum, and 3 of them in Paris at the Paleo Collection. So this is one of the manuscripts, and typically in all of these manuscripts, the text we're going to talk about is on the other side. So it's on the verso, whereas on the recto there's something else. And I don't have time today to talk about the other side of these manuscripts, but I'll just show you these, how these manuscripts look like. So this is also a typical feature. Unfortunately, because of the desk, you cannot see the manuscript number, but this is one of the other manuscripts in Paris. But a typical feature of these manuscripts is they're written in a relatively crude hand, what is in early catalogs sometimes described as the inferior hand. So and they're on the back of the manuscripts. This is another one, also from Paleo, and another one. This is from the British Library. And finally, the last one, this is also from the British Library. This is only a single small leaf, less than 1 sheet of paper from the original manuscript. So you have these 5 manuscripts, and the edition that was published in the Dunhuang Bianwenji collated these into a single text. But quite early people noticed, other scholars noticed, that there's something wrong with this arrangement. And specifically in 1989, so about 30 years after the original collection was published, Wang Sanqing wrote a paper in which he pointed out that 2 of these manuscripts, these 2 here, shown here, do not belong to this text, actually, because he based his arguments on a number of features that you see in these 2 manuscripts. For example, here, you see that, I don't know if you can see it properly. Okay, you have spaces between the text, and then you have a chapter title or a section title. So in this case, the story is about Bao Jiao, who was a paragon of upright personality. He refused to eat the grains of the Zhou dynasty. And when somebody pointed out that him being away from sort of populated areas and living in a forest and eating only his own, whatever he produces, actually Confucius' disciple pointed out that it's still the grain of the land owned by the king. So then he decided just to die and not eat anymore that kind of the produce produced on the land of the king. So here you see his name twice, and the reason for that is the first one is the section heading. So these section headings are not present in the other manuscripts. Also, at the end of one of them, you do have a title, and the title is Shisheng, so the forest of categories. So Wang Sanqing pointed out that, and he has proven that it's basically these 2 manuscripts belong to a Leishu type encyclopedia. So they should not be treated the same way or should not be treated together with the other manuscripts. Here's the smaller fragment I showed you earlier from the British Library today. And you see here where one section ends, that it describes the place where this story comes from. So in this case, it comes from the Wei Shu, the history of the Wei dynasty. And again, it's not something that you see in the other manuscripts. So with this, this nice group of 5 manuscripts dealing with the stories of filial sons was reduced to 3. Later on, in 2012, there were manuscripts from the Kyosho collection in Osaka. This was a collection that sort of was unpublished for many years, and actually even the existence of this collection was not entirely open, so there were rumors about it, but recently they published several large volumes with beautiful photographs, and in one of them, this yu, which is basically hane in Japanese, so this hane 39 was another manuscript that can be grouped together with these. Now, interestingly, the stories, there are these 4 manuscripts now that have stories of the filial sons. So the first one is this one, P3536. The order is random, actually. So you have these 4 stories in them. And then in the second one, you have these 4 stories. These are consecutive stories. And in the S389 from the BL, you have only 3 stories. And then in this Hane 39, you have, well, quite a few stories, but among them, there's also something, again, that's not a typical story of filial sons. It's the Shunzi Bian, which is a transformation text. So it's a strange combination of things. Now, all of these stories, all of the manuscripts overlap with the other manuscripts. So essentially, there are only 4 texts in this group, and I only marked 3. I later realized that this Wang Wuzi is another text that does not repeat in the other ones. So these are the unique stories. Everything else matches. Like you have what you have in one manuscript, you might have in 1 or 2 of the other ones, but not in all 4 of them. And so this brings up a really, really interesting problem about, so what would have been the original text? Because you have these stories, and the stories are very closely overlap. So you have differences here and there, but it's quite clear that they belong to the same textual tradition, or the same textual lineage. So they come from the same source genetically. Here and there you see larger differences, but still everything else is word for word the same story. But if you think about a book or an original work, it's very hard to reconstruct something like that from these. Because you see, like in P3536, you have these 4 stories, and I think all of them appear in Hane 39, but they're in different order. But if you think of a work or an edition, it's quite clear that a book or a work and an edition is not just a collection of motifs or stories, but the sequence and order of those stories is just as much part of the book as the content of the stories themselves. So we cannot really think about a book at this stage. Another important thing is that these stories appear in the manuscripts not by themselves, but they appear along with other stuff. So in this case, this is manuscript 3536, the one here on the top left corner. And if we see that it's not complete in the terms of, like, the text ends prematurely and there is still space to be written. But the text that appears on this side of the manuscript is actually not just our filial stories, but a lot of other material. And I'm going to flip through quickly the French catalogue that describes this manuscript. Basically, on the front, you have this, the Da Cheng Bai Fa Ming Men Lun. And it doesn't seem to be related to the stories, and it's written in an entirely different handwriting and written quite nicely. So this is what the catalog organizer or the compilers of the catalog decided to call the recto, so the front side. Now on the back, the verso, you have what's called here as different drafts, or different, some of them just half a line long or 2 lines long. And then later on you have this announcement of the foundation of an association, these associations called shi, that were common in lay associations. They were common in Dunhuang. So this is, here we have 1.5 lines that announce the establishment of such an association. These announcements are usually much longer, and here you only have a tiny fragment. After this, you have this account of various grains, and then you have something called Xiaozi Zhuan. So if you look at the manuscript, you see that I divided, visually, the scroll, this backside of the scroll, into sections, and you can see how they are related to each other. So it's only the last bit that deals with these stories. And even in the penultimate part, which is a narrow slip, that has the announcement of that association and also part of the account of grains. So if you look at the division line between them, you can see that there's almost no division. It's the same handwriting, and it goes on. And it's basically, it's only our decision based on the contact that we separate these texts out. We basically collect, because this is the same situation with the other manuscripts as well. So we take these out and put them together into a single edition, completely ignoring the way they appear on the original manuscript. And obviously the way they appear in the original manuscript has bearing on the function and also on the source of this manuscript and of this text. So looking at these four manuscripts together, it basically, one inevitably comes to the conclusion that they do not come from one particular text. So I would here suggest that there was no Xiaozi Zhuan that these bits of text would come from at this time. We know about the existence of lots of different versions of the Xiaozi Zhuan from transmitted literature, and one of them, or the earliest of them, is ascribed to Liu Xiang in the Han Dynasty, and later on you get many different ones. And sometimes in medieval encyclopedias, they are cited, but usually it's not these snippets of text. You also see the same stories in medieval and early medieval art. They're quite common in tombs. But again, when you have an inscription, the inscription doesn't match these texts. It's only in the 15th century that you start having something like this. This is a Xiaozi Zhuan that's preserved in Japan. It's called the Youmei Koshiden, the Yangming. It's from the Yangming or the Youmei collection, the Youmei Bunko. And it's a complete Xiaozi Zhuang. It's a manuscript, but it comes from probably the 16th century. Another copy, also preserved in Japan, is something called the Funabashi Kishida, so the Chuanqiao Xiaozi Zhuan. So this is also from about the 15th to the 16th century. Kuroda Akira, who has analyzed these manuscripts in depth, he thinks that they probably go back to Chinese original and probably coming from about the 5th century or 6th century from China. But this is all a guess, basically. I mean, he has evidence for this, but what we have as material evidence is these manuscripts that are much, much later. Another manuscript that we have is from the Tangut collection in St. Petersburg. And this is, you cannot see probably, again, at the bottom, the title, but oops. Yes, okay, so we're almost there. So this is called Newly Collected Records of Compassion and Filiality. This is the English translation of the Tangut title. So the Chinese reconstruction based on the Tangut title is something called Xinji Ci Xiao Zhuan. So Ci obviously is this, I only have one slide. Yeah. Okay, so Ci is obviously this downward act of love, and Zhuan, Xiao is the downward from parents. No, from children to parents, and Ci is from parents to children. So this is potentially something called a Xiaozi Zhuan in the Chinese tradition. the colophon, or the introduction, at the beginning you have these 2 lines after the title, Entangled, and it says that this has been compiled anew and translated by somebody whose name would be in Chinese Cao Daoan. So this might have been a Chinese person who was an official in the Tangut capital and the Tangut Academy. So this text was newly compiled. So this is actually, what we see here, again, is not something that directly comes from China, but possibly that comes from different sources in China and then put together in the Tangut capital. This doesn't mean that when it was translated into Tangut and published, because it's done by imperial order, it's also part of this note. So potentially this would have been printed eventually. This is a manuscript copy of probably a printed edition. I also assume that the Chinese edition that was compiled to make the Tangut was also preserved and probably would have been disseminated or circulated the same way. But it doesn't mean that it goes back to a Chinese original. So on the basis of these, we would have to come to the conclusion, as I said, that there is no evidence to say that there was a Dunhuang Xiaozi Zhuan. So the title of my talk, which is pretty much incorrect because I sent it in months before I actually looked at this material, but in a way it's a provocative title. And what I'm trying to show that this text that I'm talking about didn't really exist at the time. Obviously, these bits of text existed, but in what sort of collection and how together, whether maybe they were part of a pictorial presentation somewhere in a tomb, which is also possible, we do not know. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Christine Mollier. She is Director of Research at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris. She is a specialist on many things, including Buddhism, Taoism, Dunhuang manuscripts. Her most recent book, and her list of publications is voluminous, so I'm just going to mention her most recent book, Buddhism and Taoism Face-to-Face, Scripture, Ritual, and Iconographic Exchange in Medieval China. Her topic today is the power of the brush, talismans for the protection of Dunhuang and its inhabitants. Please welcome Dr. Mollier.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I want also to express my thanks to the organizers of the colloquium, the Getty and UCLA, for inviting me to this great symposium. Dunhuang documents contain literally hundreds of talismans. Their massive presence is not at all astonishing. For a great many, Dunhuang manuscripts are related to religious practice and para-religious sciences, such as medicine and divination. For 2 millennia, talismans have been indispensable to Chinese ritual technologies, whether in minor rites or great liturgies, in the form of esoteric scripts written or engraved on diverse supports, such as paper, wood, metal, or pottery. Talismans are invested with prophylactic, therapeutic, and exorcistic powers. The charisma attributed to them derives essentially from the archetypal and transcendental values with which Chinese written characters were traditionally imbued. In use since the 2nd century BC, apotropaic talismans have been continuously produced down to the present day. The most ancient examples are found on funerary jars and wooden documents discovered in Han tombs. During medieval times, Taoist and also Buddhist clerics created them in profusion and innumerable forms for the purpose of expelling demons, curing patients, and granting divine protection to individuals. Written and consecrated in conformity with rigorous rites and prescriptions, talismans were, depending on their purpose, worn as amulets, reduced to ashes to be swallowed, fixed at strategic points of houses or sacred spaces, concealed in tombs, or engraved on seals of wood to permit their duplication. Though some of the talismanic ritual preserved in the Dunhuang documents belong to Taoist or Buddhist traditions, many others do not bear any specific religious identity. They pertain instead to the traditional sciences, including various fields of divination, such as astrology, horoscopy, cosmology, hemerology, topomancy, iatromancy, uranomancy, etc., or oniromancy, etc. The huge body of mantic literature produced or preserved in Dunhuang, which has been studied in the collective work directed by Marc Kalinowski and published in 2003 by the Bibliothèque nationale de France, under the title Divination et Société dans la Chine médiévale, demonstrate the high technical nature of these traditions, their fundamental importance in the formation of scientific knowledge during medieval times, and their centrality in Chinese culture and society. Their examination, as undertaken there, underlines the relationship between divinatory practices and religious activities, and they also situate these practices in their precise location in time and space, that is to say, the region of Dunhuang during the Tang and the beginning of the Song period. The analysis of the talismanic rituals prescribed by the local diviners, astrologers, medicine men, and other mantic technicians of Dunhuang provides particularly valuable information on the magico-scientific patrimony of the region and on its social and cultural context. Today, I will focus my presentation on two examples that provide significant information on the production and practice of talismans in the Dunhuang region. The first example is a 10th century manual entitled Divine Almanac for the Protection of the Household. It contains about a series of 18 talismans that are intended to solve domestic problems of all kinds and to protect families, couples, and individuals against adversity. According to the written prescription given with them, each talisman, you can see a few examples of them here, each talisman is endowed with specific benefit. Exorcism of demons, curing disease, prevention of nightmares, facilitating childbirth, enhancing mutual love, protecting travelers, etc. Most of these talismans probably had to be written on paper, but a few of them, having a topomantic function, must be inscribed on wooden strips or stakes. These talisman stakes had to be buried inside the house to ensure the protection of the family. Others were specifically intended to pacify or stabilize tombs, and thus in order to prevent and dispel sufferings due to death pollution. Interestingly, these funerary talismans are called the Divine Talismans of Dongzhongshu, referring to the famous Confucian figure. The text provides instructions and details about their material aspect, usage, and aims. They must be inscribed on 1 foot-long pitchwood stakes and buried at the 4 corners of the tomb. They are efficient, the text promises, in resolving domestic conflicts, bad harvest, and financial problems. It is interesting to compare these models of funerary talismans with artifacts brought to light by archaeology in the Gansu Xinjiang region. Here, a few examples that are preserved in the National Museum of New Delhi. These wooden stakes were excavated from tombs in the necropolis of Astana, Xinjiang province, approximately the same size as the talismanic stakes described in the Dunhuang manual. They also depict coarse anthropomorphic faces with beards. On some of them, one can read the character Dairen, substitute person, Other stakes, probably dating to an earlier period, bear inscriptions mentioning a peach person, Tao Ren. The same wood, therefore, advocated in the Dunhuang manual for the fabrication of the talisman stakes for the tomb. It is possible that they also contain talismanic graphs. There exists another manuscript version of the same talismanic manual, also discovered in Dunhuang. Although fragmentary, it contains the same series of talismans, of which a few examples can be seen here. It seems clear, therefore, that this type of talismanic manuals was in circulation among the professional diviners of Dunhuang. Were these professional diviners working freelance or in some sort of institutional framework? We know from other Dunhuang sources that many diviners were in fact officially hired by the local prefectural school. Such institutions, consecrated to teaching the classics, doctrines, and precepts of Confucianism, were also important centers for the transmission of the traditional sciences. Medicine and astrology, as well as the divinatory and mantic techniques, figured among the subject taught. Experienced diviners called masters of divination or yin-yang masters were officially employed there in order to transmit, compile, and copy the text and to establish the rules for their use. Local elites thus participated actively in the production and diffusion of mantic knowledge together with its practical application. An interest in the divinatory arts and in talismans was thus widely shared among persons of different intellectual levels and social standing, including peasants, craftsmen, merchants, and local civil functionaries, or, as we shall see, military officers. The Dunhuang manuscript show us, in effect, that the military commanders-in-chief, called Dadiang, who were responsible for the defense of the garrison towns of Gansu province, were also involved in talismanic rites. This was in order to protect the inhabitants from natural calamities and, above all, to resist the violence of invasions and inter-ethnic conflicts. 6 manuscripts related to local astromancy and meteoromancy, that is to say, the prognostic sciences based on the observation of celestial and atmospheric anomalies, bear witness to this practice. These writings stem from a method designated by the generic title Astrological Prognostics for the 5 prefectures of Western Qing, that is to say, the region, the Rossi corridor, and its 5 prefectures. The latest copy, probably dated to 872, as the colophon written at the end of the manuscript indicates. So it would have been enacted in the Jinchang commandery, situated about 80 miles to east of Dunhuang. The text bases its prognostics on actual circumstances that took place in the region. The destruction of villages, famine, mass rape, ethnic conflict among Uyghurs, Xianbei, Han, and Tibetans were among the predictions that succeeded according to the rhythm of the eclipses and of celestial and climatic anomalies. To remedy the scourge, talismanic rituals were advocated. It was the local military authority that was charged with performing them for the salvation of the people. The commander-in-chief thus combined military and religious functions. The talismans of the 5 planets, conceived for the protection of the 5 fortified towns of the Rossi corridor, are each preceded, as you can see here, by the name of the town, with a corresponding planet inscribed in large bold characters at the top of the scroll. The set begins with a talisman for Wu Wei, which is placed under the protection of the planet Mars. The next one is for Zhangye, placed under the protection of Venus. Next, one finds the talisman for Jiu Tuan under the protection of Saturn, followed by the talisman for Jinchang, placed under the protection of Mercury, and finally, the talisman for Dunhuang, placed under the protection of Jupiter. Their use was required following the observation of unusual astrological or meteorological phenomena presaging catastrophes in the region. By placing these talismans as strategic locations, the commander-in-chief appealed to spiritual forces to help him in his task. The means for the fabrication of the talismans and the ritual procedure are described. The talismans of the 5 planets must be inscribed on 7-inch long pitchwood slips. It is auspicious to place them at the 4 gates of the city. Before performing this ritual, the commander-in-chief must purify himself, take a bath, and don fresh garments. He must then carry the talismans himself, bury them at a depth of 2 or 3 inches within the city gates, and intone the following incantation. I am in charge of the protection of the inhabitants of this town, and I consider as my children. I have today detected portents of occultations of the sun and the moon, as well as evil-colored vapors which wander above the city. Fear and distress are constant. People have lost appetite and sleep. Therefore, I prostern myself and pray that the 5 planets assist me in subduing evil vapors. I will apply myself to cultivating the good in order to transform this adversity into felicity. The text adds indeed that the chief commander must, for a period of 37 days, practice virtue, promote loyalty and righteousness. He must encourage the people to display benevolence towards widows and orphans and compassion to the poor. Moreover, the text insists on the secrecy of this talismanic ritual. Do not allow this method, it writes, to fall into the hands of the ignorant, though they offer large sums of money. This method is secret and should not be transmitted. If the use of the talismans thus did not necessarily require religious accreditation, their transmission was nonetheless a mysterious matter and subject to strict rules. Where did those commander-in-chief come by the talismanic method of the 5 planets? These talismans, like other techniques of uranomancy with which they are associated, seem in fact to have emanated from local divinatory traditions transmitted within military circles. The talismanic traditions of Dunhuang bear witness to the close proximity of the field of religion with the great domain of mantic techniques. They also demonstrate that far from being the fruits of the gullibilities of untutored masses or of so-called ordinary people, the practice of talismans was ubiquitous among all social strata. Local elites shared an interest in these practices and engaged in exorcism, cults, and magical recipes that promised to resolve personal or communal problems. To conclude, I would like to show a case of Cao Yanlu, who governed the region in the 10th century. A petition dating to 984 that he addressed to the divine powers attests to his advocacy of the use of talismans to bring the sufferings of the population to an end. Following a landslide that occurred on the banks of a lake, floodwaters rose without ceasing. The local inhabitants spoke of it as a possible divine punishment, and this was confirmed by the diviners they consulted. A rite of exorcism was organized, and the petition of Cao Yanlu was solemnly proclaimed during the ceremony. Here is what we read there. We have interrogated the yin-yang masters who performed the divination. They have judged there to be no alternative but to proceed with an exorcism to eliminate the evil. We have determined the auspicious month and favorable day. All the documents and the talismans have been prepared in accord with the ritual prescriptions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Our last speaker of this panel is Dr. Paul Copp. He is Associate Professor in Chinese Religions and Thought at the University of Chicago. He is a specialist on Buddhist studies, also Dunhuang manuscripts. His most recent book is The Body Incantory, Spells and the Ritual Imagination in Medieval China, Chinese Buddhism, from 2014. His topic today is the ritualist's craft at Dunhuang. Please welcome Dr. Copp.
A pleasure and an honor to be here, and I am also grateful to the organizers and to everyone who has helped us. The manuscripts, block prints, and silk paintings found at Dunhuang make possible many kinds of studies that had not been possible before they were discovered. Among these are close studies of the natures of medieval Chinese Buddhist ritual practice. And here I don't just mean their general or generalized natures, that is, what texts were chanted for what reasons in what ritual lineages, for example. That kind of information is readily found in what we call the transmitted traditions of Buddhism, that is, the versions of its heritage found in approved standardized forms in the printed collections. These make up the foundations of the pictures of Chinese Buddhism one mostly encounters in scholarship and in what we tend to call popular understandings. Instead, what I mean here are the particular conventions and procedures of ritual action and the traces of the actual historical ritualists who composed those programs of action. These can be found on the Dunhuang manuscripts. There is perhaps no more vivid example of these traces than this manuscript, which is of course included in the Getty exhibition. Here, let me just indicate in passing the notes, apparently written by someone expert in the particular ritual, Here, let me just indicate in passing the notes, apparently written by someone expert in the particular ritual forms at which the sheet was either initially targeted or perhaps for which it had been later repurposed. Again, it is mainly on manuscripts such as those found at Dunhuang and more in newly opened Japanese collections that we can see the material traces of those we study, surely the clearest traces of what I have come to think of as the ritualist's craft. My brief presentation here concerns other traces of this craft, however. That is, evidence for the ways that ritualists composed new ritual forms. Again, not the grand ceremonies we mostly find represented in the transmitted canons, but the smaller ones we mostly find in the Dunhuang collections. This talk is a small part of a much larger study in which I attempt to answer the following simple question. What can the structures and contents of Chinese manuscript liturgies for such rites tell us about the nature of the ritual cultures in which they were produced? Toward this end, I examine three features of the liturgies. First, the natures of the frames by which scriptures were made the focuses of recitation rites. Second, the borrowings and adaptations of existing materials from which those frames were made. And third, the understandings of the nature of scriptural language implicit in all of these practices. Now, chanting text has, of course, always been at the center of Buddhist practice. Transmitted and excavated evidence both make clear that, in the case of scriptural texts, they were rarely, if ever, simply chanted by themselves without any textual or ritual frames of the sort I will be talking about here. The Dunhuang evidence, further, suggests that the grand canonical liturgies found in the transmitted canons, whether in the form of incantation scriptures or the ritual programs associated with the eminent monks of the great monasteries, were not followed strictly, at least at Dunhuang. That is because few of these texts appear among the manuscripts in forms suggesting they were chanted in the forms in which we are familiar with them from these later collections. Instead, new liturgical frames were created, usually with the following simple structure and familiar structure. First, invocation and invitation. Second, the recitation of empowering prayers or spells. Third, the main event, the recitation of a scripture or a long incantation. And finally, a closing act of some kind, often further spells and or the announcement of merit gained and directed. Today, I'd like to briefly explore two aspects of these manuscript ritual programs: the creation of new ritual frames and the adaptations of existing texts that went into the creation of these new frames. Those who composed these frames, and for simplicity's sake, I just call them ritualists here, had a wealth of conventions and techniques to draw upon, and in the larger version of this work, I explore a much wider range of them. Here, I'll limit myself to just two, and ultimately to only one of those two. The key differences between them are the sources of the paratexts, that is, the texts and formats surrounding the main text, that make them up, and the relations of those paratexts with the main text. In the first style, which I call internal, central elements of the paratexts were, internal, in the sense that they were drawn from within the main text itself, and in fact served to remake the scripture they were drawn from into shorter and more focused chantable form. The paratextual frames of the second style, which I call external, and which I'll focus on here today, are seen in the case of chanting scriptures as wholes. Though they came in history and convention to have close practical relations with the central cultic text, they were, at least initially, wholly adventitious to it, in the sense that they had no inherent relation to its content and did not serve to rework its structure. They were drawn entirely from external sources, and the cultic texts they framed remained more or less whole. For examples of this style, I take briefly a liturgy for the recitation of the scripture of the incantation of great compassion, and in more detail, a program for the chanting of the Diamond Sutra, one of the most famous works of Mahayana Buddhist philosophy, and of course one of the most storied cultic texts in Chinese Buddhist legend and practice. When the scripture for the incantation of great compassion is found in complete or close to complete form in liturgical settings on Dunhuang manuscripts, for example on the booklet known as Stein 5460, it is set up by a simple invocation, called here a Fa Yuanwen, which we can understand either as a vow or a prayer, and I give you just a tentative translation there. The manuscript is no longer complete, but it appears that it once held the entirety of the scripture. As it stands, following the brief opening prayer, it gives the title and translator of the Bhagavad Dharma version, and then provides most of the opening section of the scripture before, again, the manuscript fragment is broken off. The prefaced Fa Yuanwen, centering on the statement, quote, "chant this scripture of great compassion," unquote, goes as you see it here on the screen. Now, simply in terms of its content, this is an utterly conventional Buddhist ritual statement. What makes it important for a study of ritual framing, and what I call modular improvisation, is that it is also found, with one significant difference, as the introduction to a liturgy for the chanting of the Diamond Sutra, contained on the manuscript Stein 1846, and that's a mistake on the top there, sorry. The difference, of course, being that at the key moment, it reads, quote, "to chant this Diamond Sutra." The prayer thus, at least in its basic structure, appears to have been part of the common store of texts ritualists drew upon in order to fashion new ritual settings for the main cultic texts of the tradition. Turning to the setting for the Diamond Sutra on Stein 1846, we find invocations and spells drawn, again, from the common stock, and most notably, a set of previously minor deities, the 8 great diamond spirits, or the Ba Da Jinggang very famous, well known to many of you, I think, who came to be closely associated with the scripture in its ritual enactments. Given their importance and unique historical connections with diamond liturgies, I will focus on this last set of figures and texts, taking them as emblematic of the structural differences between, again, what I call internal and external frames. Although they have only faint presence in the transmitted tradition of printed canons, the 8 great diamond spirits were prominent in Buddhist practices of the Dunhuang region and elsewhere around the 10th century. They are paired with the scripture on a number of manuscripts, all but one of them liturgies, and are painted, as well as named, on at least 3 manuscripts, including on Pelio 4095, which you see here. Jai Fengda, a famous to us and locally prominent official and lay Buddhist practitioner of the early 10th century, attached a text to a copy of the diamond that he had made, that is the sole non-liturgy among the manuscript sources for the 8 figures. It makes clear the importance with which Dunhuang locals, or at least Jai himself, viewed the connection between the Diamond Sutra and the scripture, the diamond spirits, and the scripture it is in their nature to protect. The text, which Jai may have compiled and not merely copied, is the, quote, record of the spiritual efficacy and blessings gained from chanting the Diamond Sutra, a collection of tales extolling the miraculous powers of the sutra. After the tales, there are 2 more texts concerning the potency of the scripture and the proper manner for its enactment. First, the hymn on the blessings of bestowing the Diamond Sutra, composed by the Kaiyuan Emperor, which are verses attributed to the Tang Emperor Xuanzong. And finally, an untitled prescription for the chanting of the diamond that, again, features the 8 great diamond spirits. The final portion of this text begins, quote, anyone who wants to chant the Diamond Prajna Paramita Sutra must first invoke the names of the 8 great diamond spirits and be of perfect sincerity of mind, and then, and only then, chant the sutra. These 8 great diamond spirits will come to protect those who chant this sutra, unquote. The text then gives the standard list of the 8, along with their powers and principalities, as I think of them, whose translation I bring back onto the screen for you here. It is rare to have direct evidence of ritual prescriptions like this one reflected in actual historical sources. But as we have seen, a number of the liturgies noted here feature the 8 great diamond spirits in precisely the place that Jai's text says they should be. Stein 1846, which, as I noted, bears the invocation text found in slightly different form also within the Incantation of Great Compassion liturgy on Stein 5460, is one of the most complete. Its chanting program, echoing Jai's own preface to the diamond, begins with a legend of the scripture's history in China. Here, the preface to Great Master Fu's verses on the Diamond Sutra. This work was said to have been drawn from a semi-legendary commentary to the Diamond Sutra attributed to one Fudasher, or Great Master, or Mahasattva Fu, a 6th century layman who, legend tells us, was responsible for the conversion to Buddhism of the famous Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty, as many of you will know, one of the greatest patrons of the religion in Chinese history. The text, though it does not survive in any transmitted edition that I know of, clearly achieved a degree of popularity well beyond Dunhuang. Aside from Stein 1846, portions of the text survive in Uyghur translation on manuscripts from Turfan, and a Chinese version was listed by the Korean monk Gihwa in the 15th century as one of the 5 principal commentaries on the Diamond Sutra. Now, immediately following this text in the program on Stein 1846 is the injunction, again noted earlier, that those who would chant the diamond must first invoke the 8 great diamond spirits. Following this, before their 8 names are 2 spells. The first is a mantra in 15 syllables called the mantra for the purification of spoken karma, a kind of spiritual palate cleanser, if you will, intended to rid the chanter of the ill effects of past misdeeds committed with words. The next spell is called the mantra of offerings to the Bodhisattva Shukong, or Akashagarbha. After this comes an especially interesting example of the kind of adaptation of classical sources common in these materials. After the statement, Yun He Fan, which is difficult to interpret, at least for me, but means perhaps something like one asks how to chant it. The liturgy contains lines on the diamond-like nature of the Buddha's true body, and thus, of course, of reality itself, clearly drawn from Dharmakshema's 5th century Chinese translation of the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. In its original context, these lines are the first in a series of questions asked of the Buddha by the Bodhisattva Mahakāssyapa. And I quote here, I ask, how did the Buddha attain his immortal state, his diamond-like indestructible true body? By what means did he attain the power of great solidity, that is perfect reality? I ask, how can one completely reach the other shore of liberation? By means of this sutra. Would the Buddha open the sublime gate and explain it for all beings? Unquote. On the manuscript, after this quotation, the nature of the diamond, right here, not only reality, or the Buddha's body, but also the text for which it is now an emblem, is asserted and further clarified, which leads to the prayer noted earlier, again adapted, it seems, from common stock. So by this paratextual language, legend, prescription, assertion, incantation, and prayer, all of which we might again characterize as external or adventitious, in contrast to the internal or intrinsic language featured in other sorts of liturgies from Dunhuang, the scripture at the heart of this rite was framed as a cultic object of great power. The liturgy next has the ritualist seal the space in which the rite takes place. The invocation of the diamond spirit protectors of the action and its object is introduced with the simple title here, just Invitation of the 8 Diamond Spirits without the great. Then the 8 are named and characterized in precisely the words seen earlier, though without the final assertion of the lordship of each figure. Added to them, without comment or introductory title, are invocations of 4 more figures with the diamond epithet. For reasons of time, I'll skip them here. After this 6-fold preface comes finally the main event itself, that is, of course, the chanting of an edition of the Diamond Sutra. After giving this edition, the liturgy then closes with 2 sets of texts. The first consists of 3 verses that appear to be unattested outside the 2 versions of this liturgy, though if people know of other ones, I'd love to hear about it. One each for the 3 natures, each of the 3 natures of reality, described usually in consciousness-only Buddhist philosophy, that is the imagined, dependent, and perfect natures. The second are 3 final spells that, as Neil D. Schmidt has noted, elsewhere in slightly different versions close out other Diamond Sutra liturgies, as well as Jaifeng Da's own edition of the text. The 3 spells, each shorter than the last, are named the mantras of the great body, of wish fulfillment, and the heart of the heart, which you see here. Now, just some general words by way of a conclusion. In the scriptures of Buddhism and in its devotional rites, the words of the Buddha are asserted to be inviolable, sacred, supremely potent, the very essence of reality itself. In such ritual contexts, they are to be worshipped, to be worshipfully reproduced as perfectly as possible. They cannot be altered, edited, or otherwise treated as normal human speech. But behind the curtain, as it were, in the practices of Buddhist ritualists, another view of these words becomes clear. In these practices, the speech of the Buddha was fully open to transformation, reframing, and reuse. Props, if you will, employed to stage the real and kept afterwards as the makings of new and different performances later. Such practices, at least for me, often remind me of Evans Pritchard's famous descriptions of the contextual transformations in newer religious practice of, quote, the sacred pole associated with God, the spirits of their lineage, and also with its ghosts, unquote, back into just something on which you can hang things. Such behavior toward religious language, which is widely evidenced on Dunhuang Buddhist liturgical manuscripts, was inherent to the work of the ritualists whose job it was, again, to stage and restage the potent cultic objects of their tradition in ways appropriate to the needs of the moment. As I noted earlier, it is only when properly framed with language, behavior, bodies and objects arranged carefully in space, that words, spoken or inscribed, take on the kinds of heightened status that they have in religious practice. Now, beyond what they suggest about the natures and conventions of Buddhist ritualist practice in the China of the 9th and 10th centuries, the preliminary investigations of this study, I think, or I hope, also shed some light, too, on the history of this practice in Buddhist China and beyond. First, the manuscripts, as so often, appear to be evidence for an important layer of Chinese Buddhist history that was largely ignored by the compilers of the transmitted, that is printed, often with imperial support, textual tradition. With close examination, we can begin to see some details of this history. Though the practices I explore here, and again much more so in the longer version of all this, were often strongly local in character, or so I think, in the sense of being shaped by the particular needs of their times and populations, they were not entirely local. At times, indeed, there appear to have been close connections within a far-flung body of Buddhist manuscripts, stretching from Dunhuang to Japan, some of which constitute some of our earliest editions of certain Buddhist texts. Strikingly, these manuscript connections in certain cases appear to have been closer than were those linking the manuscripts and the imperially printed editions, which have typically been taken as the standard and best editions of texts in Buddhist East Asia. Such evidence suggests that the subterranean, if you will, history of religious practice and textual transmission glimpsed in the Dunhuang liturgies was important indeed. In fact, though it is far beyond the scope of this study, comparison of its preliminary findings with those of Koichi Shinohara's recent book, which explores very similar cultures of ritual practice and composition in India in great detail, and I recommend it to you highly, suggests the possibility that the local culture of ritualist craft, indeed sketched here, may have in fact stretched across Buddhist Asia. Thank you so much.
For Imre, 3 or 4 short questions. From 1957, when it was published, Wang Zhongming's Dunhuang Bianwenji was the standard edition. I don't know if you're aware of the 1997 publication by Huang Zheng and Zhang Yongquan, Dunhuang Bianwen Jiaozhu, which is much more critical. So I think you should compare their approach, or whether they even included Xiaozizhuan at all, because they have a much more rigorous approach to the manuscripts. I'll go on with my other questions. Okay, so I didn't know about Hane 39 before. I guess this is a new discovery, perhaps by you. But I'm very, very interested in the fact that it has both Shunzi and Shunzi Bian. And I want to know if the manuscript actually says Shunzi Bian, or whether that's somehow your edition or somebody else's edition, a modern editor, because I would like you to, if it does say Shunzi Bian, I wonder whether it matches the Shunzi Bian in the Bianwenji and in the Bianwen Jiaozhu. That would be an extremely important discovery if it really were Shunzi Bian, and how much it differs from the Shunzi story.
Okay, the first question is that, yes, I'm aware of the new edition, or several new editions of these texts, but I used Wang Zhongming's collection because that's where the title appears first, so that's why I cited it. Although the title Xiaozizhuan doesn't appear anywhere in any of the manuscripts, so within the manuscript they are not identified as that. But even in the new edition, say like Zhang Yongquan's edition of the Dunhuang Xiaoshuo Wenji, he also includes these texts. He only uses the 3 texts so he takes into account Wang Sanqing's sort of critique, and it's very convincing, in fact. But he still includes these 3 texts and gives them the title Xiaozizhuan. And if you look up Xiaozizhuan anywhere on the web, on the Baidu or Wikipedia, it's always the same. It still has the title, and there's still these 3 manuscripts included, or sometimes 5 manuscripts included.
But Imre, when Zhang Yongquan and Wang Zheng, when they list titles, they distinguish between modern tentative titles and that were assigned by modern editors and titles that are actually on the scroll. But Wang Zhongming didn't do that. So
Yes,
that's,
okay.
yeah, you have to check and see whether they call it Xiaozidruan inside of block parentheses, because that will tell you whether they really accept that title. I doubt that they do.
No, I think they make a distinction not between what they accept or not, but whether this is a title that's included in the original text, or it's something assigned by modern people, and they use this title. I don't know if it's in, it's marked with an asterisk or not, but they use the title. And not just them, everybody uses the title. So as far as to the second question, well, the book came out in 2012, so I think quite a few people probably noticed this text and many other different texts, but it was Gen Yukiko who wrote a couple of papers about this. And so she also described the manuscript in detail. I think she was the first one I've seen in print, at least, but that's only a Japanese, 2 Japanese articles. I haven't seen a Chinese one or one written in Western language. As to the Shunzipian, if I recall it correctly, the Shunzipian, the title appears in the manuscript, so it is called Shunzipian. I haven't compared it with the other manuscript yet, but the title is there. And interestingly, it's actually in a very weird way, because you have all of these Xiaozidruan stories, and the Shunzibian is inserted after the Shunzi story, but before the poems that go with the Shunzi story. So basically the poems become part of the Shunzibian rather than the Xiaozidruan story. But it's the same poem that you see on the other 2 other manuscripts here, and they belong to the story rather than the transformation text.
Yes, Robert.
Yeah, the last slide. Yeah, come loud. The last slide, you show a manuscript. What language is that? It looks like Chinese, but it more looks like Xu Bing's Tianshu.
Well, that was actually more widely used than Xu Bing's Tianshu. It's the Xixia Wenzi, so it's a Tangut language, and so the text dates to approximately the second half of the 12th century. So in Chinese chronology, that would be the Song period. So this would be the earliest text that's titled Xiaozidruan, but it's actually, interestingly, it's only the 2nd volume. So we don't have the 1st volume. The 2nd volume is complete, but the 2nd volume doesn't have any of the filial stories. It has stories about relationship between people like mother-in-laws and cousins, brothers, rather than the same stories which are always about, well, usually father to mother, son to mother or son to father.
Thank you very much. And I have one more question. A lot of the manuscript that got these modern chops. Are they government chops or from the Chinese government or what?
The seals, the oval seals,
Yes.
would be the British Museum seals and also the Bibliothèque Nationale seals.
Thank you.
Yes, Eugene.
Well, I want to thank 3 speakers for excellent presentation. But the question is more for Paul, and I think occasions like this really, interdisciplinary exchanges really benefits a lot for those of us who do art history. And you again provide us with a wonderful conceptual framework. I really like the inner outer, that framework, and so. It's going to be helpful. But as art historians, I can't help noticing visual details, and sometimes I guess you guys provide a grand roadmap and not caring about the sort of a wallpaper you kind of put up there. I mean, there was that wonderful detail you show with that monster carrying 2 dragons. Each has itself carries a little pearl, which is a very charged loaded image. And the inscription notice says that the seal is move to the east gate, and this is where you paint the deity. So probably it's not fair to put you on the spot because your interest is in the larger framework. But if you can help us illuminate that detail, because that's a extraordinarily loaded and interesting detail, and I wonder if your study has covered that ground yet, or maybe it's something you'll do in future.
Is this on? Yeah. In this project, I'm simply using this stuff as examples to try to think about these frames and how liturgies were put together. So I've just begun to sort of do this stuff. I haven't really got into actually looking at these at that level, which I should. Although, to be honest, in the chapter that this is all toward in a notional future book, I don't need to, but I'm very interested in these questions. I don't want to be seen as somebody who doesn't do the details. Everything is in the details. I forget which one, the good guy or the bad guy's in the details, but I apologize that in terms of this particular argument, I'm simply looking at in terms of frames, so sorry. This is not an attack on art history. Art historians.
Sorry. Because this looks exactly as an Indian arch with makara, naga, makara, and it's exactly the same with the gardens of flowers pending. So you see that in early Indian art and after in Southeast Asia. You mean the finger?
And then its relation to the dragon, its snake, all that.
Yeah, the hand, you mean?
Yeah,
the hand. Yeah, the seal. Oh, this I wasn't on that part. Sorry.
That was a really great panel, and I have questions for all of you. I'll stick to one. Professor Galambos, I am interested in taking this. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you about the use of the hard pen in Dunhuang manuscripts, because I know this is something you've written about in the past, so it's maybe an opportunistic question, but the fact that we see Chinese texts and drawings, in fact, some of which are in the exhibition, being produced with a stylus instead of a brush is hugely important for art history. So I'm wondering, and maybe just within the context of the Xiaozedruan research, so do there seem to be patterns for the use of the pen? Do we have a sense of dates with any kind of precision? Are there types of materials you've encountered that seem not to be eligible for production with a pen? Anything like that, I'd love to hear. Thank you.
Well, there are no dates on these manuscripts except for one which was discounted as not belonging to this group. And there the date is 928, or 60 years after, 988, probably 928. So that's the only date we have. As far as the use of hard pen, now I don't have it here. I haven't looked at it from this point of view, but I'm assuming, most of this material just comes from after the Tibetan period, so from the Guijin period. So supposedly this should be written with a hard pen, but I haven't looked, to be honest. As far as the hard pen theory, that is really goes back to Professor Fujieda, and it's sort of a Japanese approach to Dunhuang manuscripts, and it hasn't been very influential recently, or hasn't been very a hot topic recently, but it used to be, I think, about 20 years ago or 10 years ago. Doesn't mean it's wrong. I advocate the same method. I think it's right, but it's just people in Dunhuang studies, I think, outside of Japan haven't looked at it too much.
Yes, sorry.
Hi. Christine, I was wondering if you had any sense, that was such a rich paper, thank you so much, because there's a lot of printed woodblock prints of like Avalokiteshvara and so forth that talk about protection of the state. So it was nice to see all the textual material that backs up that anxiety about the borders and about protecting the state. But I just wondered if you had any sense about how those rituals, or when or where those rituals were performed and how frequently, and what was the context or the environment, because obviously it's not just something in the abstract. Or was the copying of the text enough? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, actually, I cannot answer really precisely. The document is of course dated. I can hear you. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Yeah. But no, we don't have any details. This is pronostics. You know, it's a divinatory manual, and so it's certainly based on some real circumstances. But this is prediction. This is predictory events, and the talismans are presented as ritual tools, you know, to be used by these military authorities. But we don't have any evidence of course, of the if this has been actually been used by these people. But very likely it could have been. Did I answer your point, or did I?
I mean, aren't there temples that are like Anguosi and stuff like that, right? You know, where they talk, the temple is dedicated to the protection and the peaceful security of the country or the kingdom or something. So I mean, there's no speculation at all about the connection between the concept of state or border protection and then how it must have been carried out in practice?
This I really don't know. I don't know precisely.
Sonia.
My question is also for Christine. Thank you so much for your paper here. I'm here. Okay. So you show us quite a range of talismans from Dunhuang caves. And if they were actually being used, they would have been buried in tombs or stuck to city walls. So what exactly the copies that we are seeing? Were they prototypes for more copies to be made, or are they additional copies? Or could you elaborate a bit more on this?
Oh yes, thank you for this question, because this is a very important point. The hundreds of talismans that have been found in Dunhuang are usually in scriptures, in religious scriptures, or they are included, as the one I've seen, they have shown there, in manuals, and they are meant to be copied. They are models. You know, they are meant to be copied on proper supports and then consecrated by proper rituals, which include mudras and dharanis and certain ritual or purification and prescription by the people creating them. And then they have to go into another ritual procedure, which is their destruction, their ritual destruction, because they are whether burned and turned into ashes to be swallowed by the patients, or they are concealed in tombs, or they are placed in strategic points of the houses or ritual spaces, and destroyed by the effect of being exposed, and so they are not meant to last. And we have actually only one example known in the Dunhuang collections which has survived, which is the one I've seen at the beginning, the stain painting 170, which is obviously an operational consecrated talisman that has been preserved, probably because it includes iconography, astrological iconography. It's one of the two of the 5 planets. And this is the only example of a real talisman that has survived in Dunhuang collections.
I think we have time for one more. Okay, then it's time for lunch.